A millionaire is saved by a boy selling sweets on the street and uncovers a forgotten past. When trying to help the boy's family, he finds evidence of fraud that connects him to a past decision. The situation draws the anger of an old partner who will do anything to stop him from discovering the truth. Now he must race against time to redeem himself and save the boy's life. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching us from. The sun was setting over the skyline of Chicago, painting the heavens with hues of orange and pink that contrasted sharply with the imposing glass and steel towers. On the 40th floor of one of the most luxurious buildings on Michigan Avenue, Richard Morgan, 55, CEO of the conglomerate Morgan Enterprises, gazed out at the city below with a distant look. His reflection in the window revealed a man with sharp features, perfectly groomed gray hair, and an impeccable suit that cost more than the annual salary of many of his employees. The silence in the office was broken only by the soft clinking of ice in his glass of whiskey. Richard swirled the drink thoughtfully, his mind wandering over the events of the day. Another board meeting, another billion-dollar acquisition, another day being the most powerful man in the room. It was a routine he knew well, a dance he had mastered for decades. His phone vibrated, bringing him back to reality. It was his assistant, Emily. "Mr. Morgan, remember you have the charity dinner tonight?" Richard sighed. These social events were necessary but tedious. "Yes, Emily. Is the driver on his way?" "Yes, sir. He should be here in 15 minutes. "Great. Thank you." He hung up the phone and turned his gaze back to the city. The lights were beginning to flicker on, creating a carpet of urban stars. For a moment, Richard felt a pang of something. Loneliness. Emptiness. He quickly pushed the thought away. Feelings were for the weak, and he hadn't gotten where he was by being weak. Descending to the building's garage, Richard found his driver, Anthony, waiting beside a sleek black Mercedes-Benz. "Good evening, Mr. Morgan," Anthony greeted, opening the rear door. Richard merely nodded, entering the vehicle. As the car glided through the congested streets of Chicago, he checked emails on his smartphone, responding with cold efficiency. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest. Richard gasped, his hand clutching his shirt. The phone slipped from his fingers. "Mr. Morgan, are you okay?" Anthony's concerned voice sounded distant. The pain intensified. Richard tried to speak, but no words came out. His vision began to darken at the edges. He realized with growing dread that he was having a heart attack. "Anthony. Hospital." He managed to stammer before losing consciousness. The driver, in a panic, accelerated, seeking the fastest route to the nearest hospital. But fate had other plans. In the rush and confusion, Anthony took a wrong turn, entering a neighborhood on the south side. The narrow, poorly lit streets were a stark contrast to the wide avenues of downtown. Modest homes and small businesses replaced the skyscrapers. Anthony, lost and desperate, didn't notice when Richard, still unconscious, slipped and accidentally pressed the door release button. On a sharp turn, the door opened and Richard's limp body rolled out of the vehicle, landing on the sidewalk of a quiet street. Anthony, focused on finding his way back and stunned by the situation, didn't notice his boss was missing from the back seat. There, on the cold sidewalk of a neighborhood he had never visited, lay the most powerful man in Chicago. His expensive suit now dirty, his pale face illuminated only by the faint light of a nearby street lamp. A few feet away, a skinny 12-year-old boy was returning home after a day of selling candy at the traffic lights. The boy, named Peter, stopped abruptly when he saw the man lying on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, looking around for help. There was no one. With a racing heart, he approached Richard. "Mister, are you okay?" There was no response. Peter, gathering all his courage, touched Richard's neck, feeling a weak pulse. The man was still alive but needed urgent help. In an act of pure kindness and bravery, Peter grabbed Richard's arms and began dragging him toward his house, just a few yards away. It was a simple shack made of wood, but it was the only safe place the boy knew. "Mom! Mom!" Peter shouted, panting as he pulled Richard inside. "I need help!" Mrs. Maria, a woman in her early 40s, her face marked by the weariness of a hard life, appeared at the door, her eyes widening at the scene. "My God, Peter, what happened?" "I found him on the street, Mum. I think he's sick." Together, mother and son managed to place Richard on the old couch in the living room. Mrs. Maria checked the man's vitals, her experience as a nursing assistant at a local clinic coming to the fore. "He's had a heart attack," she murmured, worried. "Peter, run to Mr. Joe's pharmacy, ask for an aspirin tablet, quick." As Peter dashed out, Mrs. Maria loosened Richard's tie and collar, trying to make him more comfortable. She noticed the fine fabric of his suit, the gold watch on his wrist. Who was this man, and how had he ended up here? Peter returned minutes later, out of breath with the tablet. Mrs. Maria dissolved it in water and carefully made Richard swallow the mixture. Slowly, color began to return to the businessman's face. The following hours were a vigil. Mother and son took turns monitoring the stranger's breathing on their couch. As the night deepened, rain began to fall outside, the sound of droplets on the tin roof creating a soft, constant melody. It was almost dawn when Richard finally opened his eyes. Confused, he blinked several times, trying to understand where he was. The wooden ceiling, the smell of mold and simple food, the sound of the rain, everything was strange and unfamiliar. Beside him, Peter, who had just taken over the watch, observed with attentive and curious eyes. When he noticed the man had awakened, the boy approached cautiously. "Mister, are you okay?" Richard turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting the boy's. For a moment he was speechless, trying to process the situation. Finally, in a hoarse voice, he asked, Where am I?" Peter, with a shy smile, replied, "In my house, sir. I found you passed out on the street and brought you here. My mom took care of you all night." Richard tried to sit up, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. Slowly, memories began to return. The office, the car, the sudden pain. "How long was I—" "All night, sir," Peter answered. "You had a heart attack. That's what my mum said." Richard looked around, absorbing the details of the modest environment. The poorly painted wooden walls, the old furniture, the burnt cement floor. It was a world completely different from his own, a parallel universe he barely knew existed. "What's your name, kid?" Richard asked, his voice softer than usual. "Peter, sir, Peter Johnson." At that moment, Mrs. Maria entered the room, surprised to see Richard awake. "Oh, thank God you're awake. How are you feeling?" Richard, still dazed, replied, "Better, I think. Mom, Maria Johnson. I'm Peter's mother." An uncomfortable silence hung in the air for a few seconds. Richard, accustomed to being in control of every situation, found himself completely lost. For the first time in decades, he felt vulnerable. "I thank you for your help," he finally said, his voice betraying an emotion he couldn't name. "You saved my life." Peter smiled, a frank and genuine smile that Richard hadn't seen in years. "You don't need to thank us, mister. We just did what was right." At that moment, looking into the honest face of that boy, Richard felt something stir within him. A strange sensation, almost forgotten. Gratitude? Humility? He wasn't sure. What Richard didn't realize was that this moment, seemingly simple, would be the catalyst for a series of events that would change his life forever. There in that humble shack, surrounded by strangers who had taken him in without question, the powerful businessman took the first step on a journey of self-discovery and redemption. As the rain continued outside, washing the streets of Chicago, inside that small house, a silent transformation began to take place. A transformation that would affect not only Richard, but everyone around him, redefining the meaning of success, power, and above all, humanity. The morning advanced slowly in the Johnsons' small shack. Richard, still lying on the worn-out sofa, watched the rays of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden planks, creating curious patterns on the cement floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the aroma of toasted bread. Mrs. Maria entered the room, carrying a tray with a steaming cup and a few slices of bread. "You need to eat," she said, with a maternal tone that Richard hadn't heard in decades. "It'll help you regain your strength." Richard adjusted himself on the sofa, feeling every muscle in his body protest. He accepted the cup with a nod, surprised by the gesture of kindness. The coffee was strong and sweet, very different from the expensive blends he used to drink in his penthouse. "Mrs. Maria," he began, his voice still hoarse, "I really need to thank you for everything you've done for me. If there's any way I can repay you—" Mrs. Maria interrupted him with a gentle gesture. "You don't need to thank us, Mr. What's your name again?" Richard Morgan." Mrs. Maria's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through them, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Morgan, here we help because it's the right thing to do. We don't expect anything in return." At that moment, Peter came running into the room, a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. Mom, look, it's in the newspaper." Mrs. Maria took the paper, her eyebrows furrowing as she read. Richard, curious, tried to lean in to see, but a twinge in his chest made him recoil. "What does it say?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Peter, excited, began to narrate. "It's about you. It says that the famous businessman Richard Morgan disappeared last night. His car was found abandoned on the south side, but no one knows where you are." Richard felt his blood run cold. Missing? How? He tried to get up abruptly, but the pain forced him to sit back down. I need to make some calls," he said, fumbling in his pockets for his phone. To his dismay, he couldn't find it. "My phone! It must have fallen when—" Mrs. Maria gently interrupted him. "Mr. Morgan, you need to calm down. Your body is still recovering from quite a shock. How about using our landline? It's not the most modern, but it works." Richard nodded, grateful. With trembling hands, he dialed his assistant Emily's number. After several rings, she answered with a distressed voice. "Hello, who is this?" "Emily, it's me, Richard." A muffled scream came from the other end. "Mr. Morgan, thank God. Where are you? We're all going crazy with worry. The police, the press, everyone is looking for you." Richard took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "Emily, calm down, I'm fine. I had a health issue, but I'm being well taken care of. I need you to do a few things for me." In the following minutes, Richard gave precise instructions to his assistant. Cancel all appointments, handle the press by stating that he was fine and on an undisclosed health retreat, and most importantly, not to reveal his location to anyone, not even the company's board. As he hung up the phone, Richard felt exhausted. The reality of his situation was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. He was literally worlds away from his normal life, depending on the kindness of strangers in a neighborhood he probably would never have visited under normal circumstances. Peter, who had been listening to the conversation with curiosity, approached timidly. "Mr. Morgan, are you really that rich guy who's on TV?" Richard looked at the boy, seeing the mix of admiration and distrust in his eyes. For a moment he considered lying, saying he was just a namesake, but something in the sincerity of Peter's gaze stopped him. "Yes, Peter, it's me." The boy's eyes lit up. "Wow, and what are you doing here in our neighborhood?" Before Richard could answer, Mrs. Maria intervened. "Peter, don't be nosy. Mr. Morgan needs to rest." But Richard raised his hand, a tired smile on his lips. "It's okay, Mrs. Maria. It's a valid question." Turning to Peter, he continued, "To be honest, Peter, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. Maybe it's fate." The words came out of his mouth before he could think, surprising even himself. Richard Morgan, the man who had built an empire based on facts, numbers, and cold strategies, talking about fate. The rest of the day passed slowly. Richard alternated between resting and making discreet calls, trying to maintain a minimum of control over his crumbling life. Meanwhile, he observed the Johnson family's routine. Peter went out to sell candy at the traffic lights, returning in the late afternoon with a few coins and a tired smile. Mrs. Maria sewed clothes to supplement the income, her calloused hands moving deftly over the fabric. The simplicity and dignity with which they faced daily hardships touched Richard in a way he hadn't expected. That night, sitting at the simple kitchen table, sharing a modest dinner of rice, beans, and a bit of meat, Richard found himself engaged in a genuine conversation for the first time in years. Peter spoke animatedly about his dream of becoming a soccer player, while Mrs. Maria shared stories of her youth. It was during this conversation that Richard noticed something strange. When he tried to pay for the meal with his premium credit card, he found it was blocked. He tried another and another, all declined. It must be some system error, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. But an uneasy feeling began to grow in his chest, and it wasn't related to his recent heart attack. That night, lying on the sofa that now served as his bed, Richard couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with questions. Why were his cards blocked? Why hadn't Anthony, his trusted driver, noticed he had fallen from the car? And why, despite all the confusion and uncertainty, did he feel strangely at peace? On the other side of the room, Peter slept peacefully on a mattress on the floor, having insisted on giving his room to his mother. Richard watched the boy, marveling at his unpretentious generosity. How could someone with so little give so much? A noise outside caught his attention. Carefully, so as not to wake Peter, Richard got up and went to the window. On the poorly lit street, he saw a dark car parked, the engine running. For a moment he thought he saw a familiar face in the driver's seat, but the car soon drove off, disappearing into the darkness. A sense of unease took hold of him. Something was wrong, very wrong. But what? Returning to the sofa, Richard realized that his life had changed irrevocably in the last 24 hours. The man who had woken up yesterday in his luxurious penthouse was not the same man now contemplating the wooden ceiling of a shack on the south side. As sleep finally enveloped him, Richard was certain that his journey was just beginning. The universe, in its infinite wisdom or cruel irony, had given him a second chance. A chance to see the world, and himself, with new eyes. What would he do with this opportunity? The answers, he knew, would come with time. For now, all he could do was surrender to the unknown and hope that somehow it would all make sense in the end. With these thoughts, Richard finally fell asleep, the sounds of the night on the south side lulling him. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the silent transformation taking place inside that small shack. A transformation that soon would echo far beyond the narrow streets of that forgotten neighborhood. The dawn brought a different Chicago to Richard Morgan. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the cracks of the shack didn't find the businessman in his Egyptian cotton sheets, but rather stretched out on a worn-out sofa with a sore back and a mind in turmoil. As he got up, Richard felt the weight of recent events. His body, still recovering from the heart attack, protested with every movement. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort that bothered him. A sense of urgency and apprehension took hold of him. Mrs. Maria was already up, preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. The smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee filled the air, bringing a comforting familiarity amidst the chaos his life had become. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she greeted with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Richard nodded, still adjusting to the reality of his situation. "Mrs. Maria, I really need to get back home today. There are urgent matters I need to attend to." Mrs. Maria's smile faltered for a moment. "Of course, I understand. But are you sure you're in any condition? The doctor from the clinic will be here this morning. I thought it best to have someone examine you." Before Richard could protest, the doorbell rang, a shrill metallic sound that echoed through the house. Peter, who had been sleeping on the mattress, jumped up, startled. Mrs. Maria went to answer, returning moments later accompanied by a middle-aged man wearing a worn white coat. "Mr. Morgan, this is Dr. Clark," she introduced. The doctor greeted Richard with a firm handshake. "So you're our mysterious patient. Mrs. Maria told me what happened. Let's take a look at you." Reluctantly, Richard submitted to the examination. Dr. Clark listened to his heart, checked his blood pressure, and asked a series of questions about his medical history. "Well, Mr. Morgan," the doctor began after finishing the exam, "you've been very lucky. The heart attack was relatively mild, but that doesn't mean it's not serious. You need rest, a proper diet, and most importantly, to avoid stress." Richard laughed bitterly. "Doctor, avoiding stress isn't exactly an option right now." Dr. Clark looked at him seriously. "I understand you must have important responsibilities, but nothing is more important than your health. I suggest you stay under observation for at least another day." Richard was about to argue when his phone, which Mrs. Maria had found fallen near where Peter had rescued him, rang. It was Emily, his assistant. "Mr. Morgan," Emily's voice sounded tense. "We have a problem. Other police are here at the office. They have a search warrant." Richard's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, Emily? What's this about?" "I'm not entirely sure, sir. They mentioned something about financial fraud and falsified documents. They're taking computers, files. Mr. Morgan, they want to speak with you urgently." Richard's head was spinning. Fraud, falsified documents, none of it made sense. "Emily, listen carefully. Don't tell them where I am. Tell them I'm on a medical retreat and will contact them as soon as possible. Understood?" "Yes, sir, but—" "No buts, Emily. Do as I say. I'll call soon." Richard hung up the phone, his mind in a frenzy. What the hell was going on? He looked around, noticing the concerned looks from Mrs. Maria, Peter, and even Dr. Clark. "Is everything all right, Mr. Morgan?" asked Mrs. Maria, her voice laden with worry. Richard forced a smile. Yes, just some work issues. Nothing to worry about." He turned to the doctor. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I really need to go. I promise I'll take care of myself." Dr. Clark sighed, clearly displeased. "Very well, but I'll prescribe some medications and recommendations. Please follow them strictly." As the doctor wrote the prescription, Richard mentally prepared himself to face whatever was happening. He needed to return to his reality, understand what was going on with his company, with his life. It was at that moment that Peter approached, holding something in his hands. "Mr. Morgan, I wanted you to have this." The boy extended a small package. Curious, Richard unwrapped it. Inside were some homemade candies, the same ones Peter sold at the traffic lights. "They're my best," the boy said with a shy smile. "So you'll remember us." That simple, genuine gesture hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Here was a boy who barely knew him, offering the little he had. The emotion caught him off guard, and he felt his eyes well up. "Thank you, Peter," he said, his voice choked. This means a lot to me." Mrs. Maria approached, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Mr. Morgan, you'll always be welcome here. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Richard nodded, unable to express in words the gratitude he felt. These people, who lived with so little, had given him so much in such a short time. After saying his goodbyes, Richard stepped out onto the street. The contrast between the humble neighborhood and the life he was about to return to had never seemed so stark. He hailed a cab, giving the address of his penthouse in the upscale part of the city. During the ride, Richard tried to organize his thoughts. What could have gone so wrong in just 2 days? Who was behind the fraud allegations? And why were his cards blocked? Upon arriving at his apartment, the familiarity of the luxurious surroundings didn't bring the expected comfort. On the contrary, Richard felt strangely out of place in his own home. The oppressive silence and the panoramic view of the city now seemed cold and distant. Heading to his private office, Richard turned on his computer, determined to find out what was happening. It was then that he noticed something strange. Several important files seemed to have been accessed and modified recently. An unread email caught his attention. The sender was anonymous, but the subject made his heart race. "The truth always comes out, Richard." With trembling hands, he opened the message. The content was short and cryptic. "You thought you could bury the past forever. The shadows you created have finally caught up with you. Prepare to lose everything." Attached to the email was a document. Upon opening it, Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was a detailed report of suspicious financial transactions, all linked to him and his company. But what shocked him most was seeing a name he hadn't seen in years: Tomorrow's Star Factory. Memories flooded his mind like a whirlwind. The factory, the workers, the unfulfilled promises, and in the midst of it all, a face, his former partner, Charles Vasquez. Richard slumped into his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him with full force. The empire he had built was under threat, and the foundations of that empire seemed to have been rotten from the start. At that moment, the sound of the doorbell snapped him out of his dark thoughts. Through the intercom, the doorman's voice sounded tense. "Mr. Morgan, there are police officers downstairs. They have a warrant and they're coming up." Panic seized Richard. In a matter of seconds, he had to decide: face the accusations or... His eyes fell on the small package of candies Peter had given him. On impulse, Richard grabbed it, along with some important documents, and headed for the service door at the back. As he descended the emergency stairs, his heart pounding frantically, Richard knew his life would never be the same. The shadows of the past had finally caught up with him, and now he would have to face the consequences of choices made long ago. Outside the building, blending into the anonymous crowd of Chicago's streets, Richard Morgan, the powerful businessman, was now just a man on the run, carrying with him nothing more than a handful of papers and a bag of homemade candies, a sweet and bitter reminder of what truly mattered in life. The streets of Chicago had never seemed so hostile to Richard Morgan. The man who just days ago had moved through the city in luxury armored cars now blended into the crowd, walking aimlessly along the crowded sidewalks of downtown. His expensive suit, now wrinkled, and the expression of helplessness on his face made him unrecognizable to those who knew him only from the pages of business magazines. With his heart still racing from the sudden escape from his apartment, Richard desperately sought a plan. His hands clutched the package of candies Peter had given him, as if that simple gift were his only connection to reality. The documents he had managed to grab in a hurry weighed heavily in his inner pocket, constantly reminding him of the gravity of his situation. As he walked, fragments of memories invaded his mind. Tomorrow's Star Factory. How could he have forgotten? It was the beginning of everything, the foundation upon which his empire had been built. But now those memories had a bitter taste, laden with guilt and regret. Without realizing it, his steps led him to Grant Park. There, sitting on a bench under the shade of a large tree, Richard finally allowed the memories to flood him completely. 25 years ago, he was just an ambitious young man fresh out of business school. Tomorrow's Star Factory was a struggling family business located in a small town in the outskirts of Chicago. Richard's father, an experienced investor, saw potential in the business and bought a significant stake, putting his son in charge. It was there that Richard met Charles Vasquez, then a talented and charismatic production manager. Together, they dreamed big. They planned to expand the factory, modernize production, and turn the small business into a national giant. At first, everything seemed perfect. Production increased, new contracts were signed, and the factory became the economic heart of the town. Richard vividly remembered the sparkle in the workers' eyes, the hope that hung in the air. But then, things began to change. Market pressures, questionable decisions, ethical shortcuts. Richard and Charles, in their quest for rapid growth, began making choices that, at the time, seemed necessary, but that he now recognized as the beginning of their moral downfall. The most painful memory, one that Richard had buried deep in his mind, finally emerged, the night he and Charles decided to close the factory without warning, transferring production to a more modern facility in another town. Hundreds of families were left without income overnight. The desperation on the workers' faces, the protests, the accusations of betrayal, it all came back with terrifying clarity. Richard abruptly stood up from the bench, feeling suffocated by the memories. It was then that he noticed a man standing a few meters away, watching him intently. Something about that gaze deeply disturbed him. On impulse, Richard began to walk quickly away, feeling the stranger's footsteps close behind. His heart pounded erratically as he blended into the crowd strolling through the park, trying to shake off his pursuer. After several minutes of a silent chase, Richard finally managed to hide behind a large bush. Panting, he watched the man pass, still searching for him with his eyes. It was then that Richard recognized him. He was one of Charles Vasquez's security guards. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Charles, his former partner and friend, was behind all of this. But why? What had happened to turn years of partnership into such an elaborate revenge? Richard knew he needed help, but who could he turn to? His family was abroad, his lawyers were probably already being monitored, and he didn't trust anyone in his social circle. It was then that an idea came to his mind. The notebook. Days ago, when he returned to Mrs. Maria's shack to thank her, he had found an old notebook hidden under a loose board. In the rush of the moment, he had taken it with him without much thought. Now, sitting in a secluded corner of the park, Richard opened the notebook with trembling hands. The yellowed pages were filled with handwritten notes, dates, names, and numbers. As he read, His face paled. There were detailed records of all the dubious transactions made during the final years of tomorrow's Star Factory. Names of politicians, bribe amounts, fraudulent contracts. Everything meticulously documented. But what shocked Richard most was recognizing the handwriting. It was Charles Vasquez's. His former partner had kept a secret record of all their illicit activities, including those Richard had been unaware of. As he flipped through the pages, one name caught his attention: Johnson. With his heart racing, Richard read the entry. John Johnson, worker, discovered compromising documents, threatened to expose, problem resolved, family relocated. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. John Johnson. Could he be Peter's father? The connection between his past and his present was beginning to form, and the magnitude of his past actions never seemed so devastating. Richard closed the notebook, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew that document was pure dynamite. It could be his salvation or his ultimate ruin, depending on how it was used. At that moment, he made a decision. He could no longer run from his past. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, not just to save himself, but to bring justice to all the lives he and Charles had affected over the years. With renewed determination, Richard stood up. His first step would be to return to the neighborhood where Peter and Mrs. Maria lived. He needed to better understand the connection between that family and his turbulent past. As he left the park, Richard didn't notice the shadowy figure watching him from afar. Charles Vasquez, with a cold smile on his lips, made a subtle gesture to his men. The game was just beginning, and he was determined to be the final winner in this battle of power and revenge. Night fell over Chicago, enveloping the city in a cloak of lights and shadows. Richard Morgan, carrying the weight of his discoveries and the fear of the unknown, plunged back into the bustling streets. His journey of redemption was just beginning, and the challenges ahead would be greater than any negotiation or acquisition he had ever faced in his corporate life. As he walked, the candies from Peter in his pocket served as a bittersweet reminder. Sometimes you have to lose everything to truly understand the value of what you have. And for Richard, that lesson was just beginning to be learned in the hardest way possible. The city lights flickered around him like distant stars, guiding his uncertain path. Each step took him deeper into the labyrinth of his past, closer to a truth that could either set him free or destroy him completely. But one thing was certain. Richard Morgan was no longer the same man who had woken up that fateful morning just a few days ago. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. With a heavy heart, but determined, Richard headed for the subway. His destination, the neighborhood where a humble family had inadvertently become the link between his dark past and an uncertain future. What would he find there? Redemption or more complications? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the lives of Richard Morgan and everyone around him would never be the same. Night had already fallen over Chicago when Richard emerged from the subway station in the neighborhood where Peter and Mrs. Maria lived. The streets, so different from the wide, well-lit avenues he was accustomed to, seemed like a maze of shadows and faint lights. The contrast between this world and the one he had inhabited until a few days ago had never been so stark. With hesitant steps, Richard made his way to the street where the Johnson family's shack was located. His heart pounded, not just from the fear of being recognized or captured, but from the anxiety of what he might discover. The revelations from Charles's notebook weighed on his mind, mingling with the recent memories of Peter and Mrs. Maria's kindness. As he turned the corner, Richard felt a tightness in his chest. The shack was dark, the door closed with a rusty padlock. There was no sign of life. For a moment he stood paralyzed, uncertain of what to do. It was then that he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mr. Morgan, what are you doing here?" Turning quickly, Richard found himself face to face with Peter. The boy was carrying a plastic bag and looking at him with a mix of surprise and concern. "Peter, I came to see how you were doing," Richard stammered, caught off guard. Peter frowned, clearly confused. "But we don't live here anymore, Mr. Morgan. Mom got a new job and we moved to another part of the neighborhood." The news caught Richard off guard. On one hand, he was relieved to know the family was well, but on the other, He felt a pang of disappointment at not finding them where he expected. "Peter, I really need to talk to your mom. It's important," Richard said, trying to maintain his composure. The boy hesitated for a moment, studying Richard's face. Something in Richard's expression must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "Okay, Mr. Morgan. You can come with me. Mom should be getting home from work now." As they walked through the narrow streets, Richard noticed that Peter seemed quieter than usual. The boy walked a little ahead, occasionally casting curious glances back. "Peter," Richard began, trying to break the uncomfortable silence, "how are you doing in the new place?" Peter shrugged. "It's better than before. The house is a little bigger, and I even have my own room. But—" He hesitated, biting his lip. "But," Richard encouraged. "Some strange things have been happening," Peter continued, lowering his voice. "Some men in suits came asking about you the other day. And yesterday I saw a car parked on the corner. There were people inside, watching our house." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Charles and his men were already tracking the Johnson family. The situation was more serious than he had imagined. Finally, they arrived at a small brick house, modest but visibly in better condition than the old shack. The lights were on, and Richard could hear the faint sound of a television coming from inside. Peter opened the door, announcing their arrival. "Mom, I'm home, and there's someone here to see you." Mrs. Maria appeared in the living room, still wearing the uniform from her new job. Her eyes widened when she saw Richard. "Mr. Morgan, my God, what happened to you?" Richard realized he must look terrible. His suit wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes tired from days of poor sleep. "Mrs. Maria, I'm sorry to show up like this, but I really need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Maria looked at Peter, then back at Richard. With a sigh, she gestured for him to come in. "Peter, go take your shower. Mr. Morgan and I need to talk." The boy obeyed, not without casting one last curious glance at Richard. Once alone in the small living room, Mrs. Maria indicated the sofa for Richard to sit. She remained standing, her arms crossed, an expression of concern on her face. "You're in some kind of trouble, aren't you?" she asked directly. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, Mrs. Maria, and I'm afraid that unintentionally I may have put you in danger too." He then began to tell her everything, about tomorrow's Star Factory, about Charles Vasquez, about the fraud allegations. As he spoke, he watched Mrs. Maria's reactions closely. Her face went from surprise to understanding, and finally to an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. When he mentioned the name John Johnson, Mrs. Maria visibly paled. You knew my husband?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "Your husband? Mrs. Maria, please, tell me what happened to John Johnson." Mrs. Maria sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "It was almost 10 years ago. John worked at the factory. He was a production supervisor. One day, he came home very agitated, saying he had discovered something terrible, that we needed to leave town immediately." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "We packed in a hurry, but before we could leave, John disappeared, just vanished. The police investigated, but they never found anything. After a while, they declared him dead." Richard felt a wave of nausea hit him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming a terrifying picture. "Mrs. Maria, I don't know what to say. I swear I didn't know about this. But now, with what I've discovered—" He hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Mrs. Maria stared at him, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and determination. "You know what happened to my husband, don't you?" Richard lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I believe I do. And I promise I'll do everything in my power to uncover the whole truth and bring justice." At that moment, a noise from the window startled them. Richard jumped up, running to look outside. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow moving in the street, but he couldn't be sure. "Mrs. Maria, you're not safe here," he said, turning to her. "Charles Vasquez and his men are already after you. We need to get you out of here immediately." Before Mrs. Maria could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Richard ran to the window again, only to see two black cars stopping abruptly in front of the house. "Quick!" he shouted. "Grab only the essentials. We need to go out the back." Panic set in. Mrs. Maria ran to call Peter, while Richard frantically searched for an exit. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the front door echoed in his ears. In a matter of minutes, which felt like hours, the three of them were slipping out the back door, running into the dark night. Richard held Peter's hand firmly, while Mrs. Maria guided them through alleys and back streets she knew well. Behind them, they could hear voices and the sound of doors being broken down. The hunt had begun. As they ran through the night, Richard knew there was no turning back. His past and present had collided catastrophically, and now he wasn't just fighting for his own survival, but for the life of an innocent family he had inadvertently dragged into the eye of the storm. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its shadows. For Richard, Peter, and Mrs. Maria, the night was just beginning, and with it, an uncertain journey toward a nebulous future, where dangers and revelations awaited them at every turn. The early hours of the morning fell over Chicago like a heavy blanket, enveloping the city in shadows and secrets. Richard, Mrs. Maria, and Peter ran through the narrow streets and dark alleys of the South Side, their hearts pounding frantically against their chests. The distant sound of voices and hurried footsteps echoed behind them, constantly reminding them of the danger that pursued them. "This way," whispered Mrs. Maria, pulling them into a dimly lit alley. Her knowledge of the neighborhood's nooks and crannies was proving invaluable in this desperate escape. Richard, still holding Peter's hand firmly, felt the weight of guilt grow with each step. How could he have dragged this innocent family into the middle of his personal storm? Peter's frightened face, briefly illuminated by a streetlight as they ran, was a painful reminder of the consequences of his past actions. After what felt like an eternity of running and hiding, Mrs. Maria finally guided them to a small abandoned building. The structure, once a small textile factory, was now covered in graffiti and had most of its windows broken. "Here," she said, panting, pushing open a rusty metal door. "We can hide here for now." The interior of the building was dark and dusty. The smell of mold and abandonment filled the air. Richard helped Peter sit in a corner, noticing how the boy trembled, both from fear and exhaustion. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, his voice betraying concern and fatigue. Mrs. Maria nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "Yes, I think so. But what are we going to do now, Mr. Morgan? We can't keep running forever." The question hung in the air, heavy and urgent. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind working frantically to find a solution. I have a plan," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But first, we need to rest a bit and think clearly." While Mrs. Maria tried to calm Peter, Richard stepped away, needing a moment to organize his thoughts. It was then that he felt something in his pocket, the old notebook he had found in the shack days ago. With trembling hands, he opened the notebook again, his eyes scanning the pages for any clue, any information that could help them in this desperate moment. It was then that a name caught his attention: Elena Rodriguez. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Elena. How could he have forgotten her? Elena Rodriguez was a former employee of tomorrow's Star Factory, someone who had always been suspicious of the company's practices. She had left years before the closure, denouncing irregularities, but at the time her accusations had been suppressed and discredited. An idea began to form in Richard's mind. If they could find Elena, maybe she could help them. She might have crucial information, evidence that could expose Charles Vasquez and the entire corruption network. Richard returned to where Mrs. Maria and Peter were, a flame of hope newly lit in his eyes. "Mrs. Maria," he began, keeping his voice low, "what do you know about a woman named Elena Rodriguez?" Mrs. Maria frowned, thoughtful. "Elena, yes, I remember her. She worked in the factory's finance department. She and John were friends. Actually—" Mrs. Maria paused, her eyes widening with a sudden realization. The night John disappeared, he mentioned he needed to talk to Elena urgently. Said she could help expose something. Richard felt a wave of adrenaline course through his body. This could be the key to unraveling the whole mystery and, who knows, finding redemption. "We need to find her," he said, determination evident in his voice. She might be our only chance to solve all of this. Peter, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. But how are we going to find this woman, Mr. Morgan? We don't even know where she lives. Richard smiled gently at the boy, admiring his perceptiveness even in such a tense moment. You're right, Peter. It won't be easy. But I have some contacts who can help. The problem is how to make those calls without being tracked. It was then that Mrs. Maria had an idea. There's a payphone a few blocks from here. It's near a 24-hour diner. If we're careful, maybe we can use it without drawing attention. Richard nodded, impressed with Mrs. Maria's resourcefulness. Great idea, but it's too risky for all of us to go. I'll go alone. You two stay here, hidden. No, Peter exclaimed, grabbing Richard's arm. What if those bad men catch you? Richard felt his heart tighten with the boy's genuine concern. Placing a hand on Peter's shoulder, he said softly, Don't worry, Peter. I promise I'll come back. Besides, I need you to stay here to protect your mum. Can you do that for me? Peter nodded solemnly, straightening his shoulders as if already feeling the weight of responsibility. Before leaving, Richard had an idea. Grabbing a piece of paper and a pen from his pocket, he quickly scribbled some instructions. Mrs. Maria, if something goes wrong and I don't come back in 2 hours, I want you to follow these instructions. It's the address of someone I trust. She'll be able to help you. Mrs. Maria took the paper, carefully storing it. Be careful, Mr. Morgan, and thank you for everything. With one last look at mother and son, Richard stepped out into the night, his heart heavy but determined. The streets were quiet, but he knew danger lurked in every shadow. Arriving at the payphone, Richard took a deep breath before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a sleepy voice answered, Hello? Mariana? It's Richard. Richard Morgan. I need your help. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of tense silence before Mariana responded. Richard? My God, it's been so long. What happened? Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years of regret and secrets. It's a long story, Murray, but I'm in trouble, and I need to find someone urgently. Someone who might have crucial information about things I did in the past. Mariana's voice became serious. Richard, what did you do? I made mistakes, Murray. Terrible mistakes. But now I'm trying to make things right. Please, can you help me find Elena Rodriguez? It's vital. There was another moment of silence before Mariana responded. All right, Richard. I'll see what I can do, but you'll have to tell me everything later. Where can I reach you? Richard gave her the payphone number and arranged to call again in a few hours. After hanging up, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Mariana was a skilled and discreet private investigator. If anyone could find Elena quickly, it was her. As he walked back to the hideout, Richard couldn't help but feel he was walking a fine line between redemption and total destruction. Each step took him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and lies, but also closer to the truth he so desperately sought. Suddenly, a noise made him freeze. Footsteps, coming his way. Richard quickly hid behind a parked car, his heart beating so loudly he feared it could be heard. Two men in suits passed by him, talking in low voices. The boss won't be happy. We've completely lost their trail. Relax, they can't have gone far. We'll keep looking. When the men turned the corner, Richard let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The danger was closer than he had imagined. Returning to the hideout, Richard found Mrs. Maria and Peter asleep, leaning against each other in a corner. The scene filled him with renewed determination. He had to protect them, had to right the wrongs of the past, not just for himself, but for all the lives that had been affected by his actions. Sitting on the dusty floor, Richard closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of rest. The next few hours would be crucial. Finding Elena could be the key to unraveling the whole plot, but it could also put them in even more danger. As the night slowly gave way to dawn, Richard Morgan, the once powerful businessman, now a fugitive seeking redemption, knew he was about to embark on the most dangerous and important phase of his journey. The fate of many depended on his next actions, and he was determined not to fail again. Outside, the city began to awaken. oblivious to the drama unfolding in its underbelly. For Richard, Mrs. Maria, and Peter, a new day brought not only the promise of light, but also the threat of ever deeper and more dangerous shadows. The morning sun had barely broken the horizon when Mariana Silveira parked her discreet car in front of a small cafe in the Pilsen neighborhood. Her eyes, trained by years of investigation, scanned every detail of the surroundings, seeming even more attentive that morning. Mariana was no ordinary woman. At 45, a respected private investigator in the field, she carried with her a history of solving complex cases and a reputation for absolute discretion. Her encounter with Richard Morgan the previous night had rekindled old memories, memories she thought she had buried long ago. Inside the cafe, sitting at a corner table, was Elena Rodriguez. The woman, now 50, maintained the same determined posture that had characterized her when she worked at tomorrow's Star Factory. Her graying hair was tied in a simple bun, and her eyes, behind her glasses, revealed a sharp intelligence. "Thank you for coming, Elena," said Mariana, sitting at the table. Elena smiled discreetly. "When you called saying it was about tomorrow's Star Factory, I knew I had to hear. That story always had many dark corners." Mariana was direct. "What do you know about John Johnson?" Elena's face immediately changed. A mix of fear and determination passed through her eyes. "John, he was too close to discovering something big. Something that could bring down the entire corruption scheme within the company. Something related to Richard Morgan and Charles Vasquez?" asked Mariana. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Exactly. John had found documents that proved a series of financial frauds, bribes, embezzlement, balance sheet manipulation, things that could mean the ruin of the company and the imprisonment of several important people." Mariana took a small recorder from her pocket. "Can I record this?" "No," Elena replied quickly. "It would be too risky. They still watch me. After what happened to John, I know they're capable of anything." The conversation was interrupted by a cell phone. It was Richard calling Mariana. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice tense. "I'm with Elena. We need to meet in a safe place. Do you have somewhere we can talk without being tracked?" Richard thought for a few moments. "I know a place. An old country house I bought years ago and never used. It's in Barrington, far from the spotlight. I'll send you the address." After hanging up, Mariana looked at Elena. "We need to meet with Richard. He can help us clarify everything." Elena hesitated. "What if it's a trap?" "It won't be," Mariana assured. "Richard is different. He seems genuinely remorseful and wanting to right past wrongs." The trip to Barrington was made with extreme caution. Mariana and Elena switched cars twice to ensure they weren't being followed, a protocol Elena had learned after John's disappearance. Richard's country house was exactly as he had described, isolated, surrounded by a small forest with no close neighbors. When they arrived, Richard was already there, accompanied by Mrs. Maria and Peter. The meeting was tense. Elena looked at Richard with a mix of anger and expectation. "So we finally meet after all these years." Richard lowered his head. "I came to apologize. I know it doesn't change what happened, but—" "Apologies won't bring John back," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting. Peter, who had been quiet until then, approached. "What happened to my dad?" A heavy silence filled the room. It was Mrs. Maria who finally spoke. "John discovered something very dangerous within the company, something that could expose a massive corruption scheme." Elena confirmed. John had found documents that proved systematic fraud, bribes to politicians, money laundering, bid rigging, all meticulously documented. "And that's why he was eliminated?" asked Peter, his voice trembling. Richard felt a pang of guilt. "I can't confirm exactly what happened, Peter, but I know Charles Vasquez was capable of anything to protect the company's interests." Elena took a yellowed folder from her bag. "I brought copies of some documents John sent me shortly before he disappeared. They're evidence that could bring down not just Charles, but an entire corruption network." Mariana analyzed the documents, her eyes quickly scanning the pages. "This is pure dynamite. With this information, we can not only expose the fraud, but also investigate John's disappearance." Richard looked at Peter. "I promise I'll help uncover the truth about your father. The boy with tears in his eyes asked, "Will the truth bring my dad back?" No one answered. The pain of loss hung in the air, heavy and insurmountable. It was at that moment that a noise of tires outside caught everyone's attention. Mariana ran to the window. "We've got company," she said, her voice serious, "and they're not friendly visitors." The silence that followed the unexpected arrival was cutting. Mariana, with the agility of an experienced investigator, quickly closed the curtains and checked the doors. Richard instinctively pulled Peter close to Mrs. Maria, shielding them. "How many are there?" Richard asked in a low voice. Mariana peeked through the window. 3 cars. At least 6 men. They seemed to be armed. Eleanor, keeping her calm, opened her folder and began separating some documents. "If they catch us, we need to ensure these proofs survive." Outside, voices began to approach. Firm footsteps echoed on the lawn in front of the house. It was obvious they knew exactly where they were. "Charles Vasquez," murmured Richard. "He found us." Peter, despite his fear, held his mother's hand firmly. Mrs. Maria hugged him, trying to convey safety. Suddenly, a loudspeaker sounded outside. "Richard Morgan, we know you're in there. Surrender and hand over the documents. We don't want bloodshed." The voice was Charles's, no doubt. Richard felt a mix of anger and fear course through his body. Years of partnership, years of silent complicity, all crumbling at that moment. Mariana whispered, "We need to split the documents. If we all stay together, we could lose everything if we're captured." Eleanor agreed. Quickly, she began making copies using a portable scanner she carried with her. "I always come prepared," she said with an ironic smile. Outside, the footsteps were approaching. Someone started trying to break down the front door. "Peter," Richard called, crouching to the boy's level, "I need you to do something very important." Peter looked at him, his eyes wide and scared but determined. "I want you to keep this flash drive," Richard said, handing over a small device. "Don't show it to anyone. If something happens to me, only give it to someone you completely trust." The boy nodded, hiding the device in an inner pocket of his jacket. Eleanor finished scanning the documents and distributed them among them. Each received a set of files, ensuring that even if they were captured, part of the evidence would survive. The noise at the door increased, wood being broken, voices giving orders. "They're going to break in any moment," Mariana warned, discreetly checking a gun she carried. Mrs. Maria, surprising everyone, said with impressive calm, "There's an exit at the back. A tunnel I built when I lived in the countryside. Few know of its existence." Richard looked at her, impressed. "A tunnel? I worked years on farms. Always thought it important to have a plan B," she replied with a discreet smile. As Mrs. Maria explained the tunnel's path, Eleanor continued distributing the documents. Each paper represented a piece of the truth, a fragment of justice that needed to be preserved. A loud bang indicated the front door had been broken down. Heavy footsteps began to approach. "Quick," Mariana whispered. "Everyone to the tunnel." Mrs. Maria opened a secret passage behind an old cabinet. It was narrow, poorly lit, but seemed to be their only chance of escape. Peter was the first to enter, followed by Mrs. Maria. Eleanor and Mariana helped Richard, who was still debilitated from his recent heart attack. Just as they were almost all inside the tunnel, a familiar voice echoed through the house. "Richard, you traitor, did you really think you could expose me?" It was Charles Vasquez. Richard looked back, his eyes meeting Charles's for a brief moment. Years of partnership, years of shared secrets, all came down to that instant. "Go," he shouted to the others. "Keep going, I'll distract them." Before they could protest, Richard closed the secret passage, leaving himself behind. The final confrontation was about to begin. The dark, damp tunnel seemed endless. Peter held Mrs. Maria's hand firmly, while Elena and Mariana guided them through the narrow, uneven path. The silence was only broken by the sound of hurried footsteps and the group's heavy breathing. "We need to go back for Richard," Peter said, his voice trembling with worry. Mariana held him by the shoulders. "We can't, Peter. It would be suicide. Richard sacrificed himself to give us a chance to escape." Elena, who was walking ahead checking the path, murmured, "He was always like that, willing to make sacrifices when it really mattered. After what seemed like hours, they finally spotted an exit. The tunnel ended in a small abandoned barn on the outskirts of Barrington. Mariana was the first to exit, checking if the path was clear. "We're clear," she announced, "but we can't stay here long." Mrs. Maria hugged Peter, trying to calm him. "Richard will be fine. He's smarter than he looks." Meanwhile, inside the house, the confrontation between Richard and Charles reached its peak. "You think you can bring me down?" Charles asked, slowly walking through the room. "I built this empire with you. We know all each other's secrets." Richard, keeping his calm, replied, "Exactly why I know how far you're willing to go to protect this rotten empire." Charles laughed coldly. "Rotten empire. We did what was necessary to grow. No one gets where we got by being nice." "We crushed dreams, destroyed families," Richard countered. "John Johnson, what did you do to him?" A tense silence settled. Charles hesitated for a moment, something Richard had never seen before. "John knew too much," Charles finally said. "He had evidence that could destroy us. I had no choice." "You had no choice?" Richard raised his voice. "There's always a choice, Charles. Always." Outside the barn, Elena began organizing the documents they had brought. Mariana prepared a plan of action. "We need to take this evidence to the authorities," Elena said. "It's proof of decades of corruption." Peter, watching attentively, asked, "And my dad? Will we find out what happened to him?" Mariana placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We will, Peter. I promise we'll uncover the truth." Inside the house, the confrontation continued. Charles pulled out a gun, pointing it at Richard. "You won't stop me from protecting what I built," he said coldly. Richard raised his hands. "You're going to kill me? Like you killed John Johnson?" Charles hesitated. Something in Richard's words made him falter. "You don't know anything," he replied, but his voice lost its initial firmness. It was at that moment that the sound of sirens began to approach. Mariana had strategically activated contacts. Charles realized he was cornered. His plans were crumbling rapidly. Outside, Peter held firmly the flash drive Richard had given him. Unknowingly, the boy carried the key that could change everything. The sirens grew closer. The fate of Richard, Charles, and everyone involved hung by a thread. The truth was about to be revealed. 6 months later, the afternoon sun gilded the small law office in downtown Chicago. Richard Morgan, now looking leaner and older, signed some documents. His suit, once impeccable and expensive, had been replaced by something simpler and more discreet. The case against Charles Vasquez had come to an end. The evidence gathered by Elena, Mariana, and the documents Peter had kept on the flash drive had been crucial in exposing a corruption scheme that spanned decades. Charles was in prison, awaiting trial, and much of his empire had crumbled. But for Richard, the real battle was internal. Peter, sitting in a nearby chair, watched Richard with a mix of admiration and caution. In the past months, they had developed a close, almost paternal relationship. Richard had committed to helping the Johnson family, not just financially, but by offering support and opportunities. "Ready to go, Peter?" Richard asked, a gentle smile on his face. The boy nodded. Thanks to Richard's support, he now attended a good school on a full scholarship. His dream of becoming a soccer player was still alive, but he also nurtured others. He wanted to be a lawyer, to help people who, like his family, had been wronged. Mrs. Maria now worked at a social project created by Richard, which offered support to families of former employees of companies that had been harmed by abusive corporate practices. Her work was crucial, as she knew firsthand the struggles of these people. On the way home, Richard reflected on his journey. The transformation hadn't been easy. He had lost almost all his fortune in the process of reparation, dedicating much of his resources to compensating the families harmed by tomorrow's Star Factory. "Mr. Morgan," Peter asked during the ride, "don't you miss all that? The mansion, the cars, the power?" Richard smiled. "Power, Peter, isn't about having things. It's about making a difference in people's lives." His words didn't sound like empty rhetoric. In the past months, Richard had become a symbol of transformation. Lectures at universities, interviews on business ethics, consulting for startups committed to sustainable practices, all had become his new mission. Elena Rodriguez, who initially viewed him with suspicion, had become an important ally. Together, They created a foundation that investigated and exposed unethical corporate practices. Upon arriving home, a modest but welcoming residence, Mariana was waiting for them. She now worked directly with the foundation, using her investigative skills to promote social justice. "We have a meeting tomorrow with John Johnson's lawyers," Mariana said. "We're close to officially reopening the disappearance case." Peter held Richard's hand. That simple gesture represented much more than a handshake. It represented trust, hope, healing. That night, after dinner, Richard looked at his new family, Peter, Mrs. Maria, Mariana, Eleanor, and felt something he had never experienced in his previous life: peace. It wasn't the peace achieved through money or power. It was the peace that comes from acknowledging mistakes, seeking redemption, committing to do better. His phone vibrated, a message from a young entrepreneur he had met at a lecture. "Your words made me rethink my business. Thank you for showing there's another way." Richard smiled. His true wealth now wasn't in bank accounts, but in the lives he managed to transform. Night fell over Chicago, enveloping the city in its dark mantle. But inside that house there was light, a light born of hope, change, the possibility of starting anew. The auditorium at the University of Chicago was packed. Hundreds of students, professors, and professionals from different fields eagerly awaited Richard Morgan's lecture. The man once known as a ruthless businessman was now seen as a symbol of transformation and hope. Peter, now 15, watched from the front row, his proud gaze evident. Beside him, Mrs. Maria and Mariana watched, moved. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began, his voice firm and confident. "Today, I'm not here to talk about business success, but about humanity." The audience remained in absolute silence. 25 years ago, I was the man who destroyed lives without blinking. My ambition was my only fuel. Today, I understand that true legacy isn't in what we achieve, but in what we give back. As he spoke, Richard remembered his journey. The scars from his heart attack, both physical and emotional, were constant reminders of his transformation. After the lecture, dozens of students approached to talk. A young man with tears in his eyes shared his story of a family harmed by corporate practices. "Your story gave me hope," the student said. "It showed that change is possible." Peter watched it all proud. His own trajectory had completely changed. A scholarship student at an elite school, he dreamed of following in Richard's footsteps, but as a lawyer, defending the rights of the vulnerable. That night, at a dinner at the foundation they had created, Elena brought important news. "We've secured another compensation for the families of the former Tomorrow's Star Factory," she announced. Mrs. Maria, moved, remembered John, her disappeared husband. Finally, after years of silence and pain, the truth was beginning to be revealed. Mariana, who had investigated the case, brought details about John's disappearance. Although they hadn't found his body, the investigations proved he had been kidnapped on Charles Vasquez's orders to prevent him from exposing the company's frauds. "Justice delayed, but justice," Richard said, holding Mrs. Maria's hand. Peter, watching the scene, realized how these people had become a family built not by blood ties, but by respect, love, and mutual commitment. The foundation they had created had already helped hundreds of families. Richard had turned his guilt into action, his pain into purpose. As they talked, an envelope arrived. It was a letter from one of the workers who had been harmed by the old factory. He thanked them for the support, for the possibility of starting over. "Every story of rebuilding," Richard said, "is a victory against the system I once helped build." The night advanced, and with it, stories of overcoming, hope, transformation. Peter looked at Richard. He no longer saw him as that distant, powerful man he had met years ago. Now he saw a father, a mentor, a human being in constant evolution. "Want to go play soccer with me tomorrow?" Peter asked. Richard smiled. "Sure, but only if you promise to study afterward." Laughter filled the room. Love, respect, hope. Feelings that once seemed so distant were now the essence of that improvised family. Life went on, and with it, the certainty that change is always possible. That redemption isn't a destination, but a path built every day, with small gestures of humanity. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Richard Morgan collapsed in the South Side neighborhood of Chicago. The man who stood there now was completely different from the cold, ambitious businessman. The foundation he had created had grown exponentially. It not only helped families harmed by corporate practices, but also offered scholarships, vocational training, and psychological support to vulnerable communities. Peter, now 20, was about to graduate from law school. His youthful dream of becoming a soccer player had been replaced by a deeper calling, defending the rights of the less fortunate. One Saturday morning, Richard and Peter walked through the university campus. The young man carried with him a research project on business ethics, personally mentored by Richard. "Remember when we first met?" Peter asked, smiling. Richard laughed. "How could I forget? A heart attack, a shack, and the beginning of everything." Mrs. Maria, now the coordinator of the foundation's social project, waited for them for lunch. Elena and Mariana would also be there. That improvised family had become something much deeper than blood ties. During lunch, they discussed the foundation's latest achievements. They had recovered millions in compensation for harmed workers, created vocational training programs, and established partnerships with universities and companies committed to ethical practices. "I got an interesting offer," Peter announced. "A law firm wants me to coordinate a social justice program." Richard hugged him, proud. That boy he had once found passed out on the street was now a brilliant young man, committed to social transformation. The afternoon was marked by a special ceremony. The foundation would inaugurate a vocational training center in an underprivileged community, exactly in the neighborhood where it all began. During the event, Richard was invited to speak. His story of transformation had become an inspiration for many. "True wealth," he said, "isn't in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we give back to society." Peter watched, moved. He remembered all the difficult moments, the escapes, the fears. Now he saw his mentor as a symbol of hope and renewal. That night, in his simple but welcoming home, Richard reflected on his journey. He had lost almost everything to gain what truly mattered: purpose, family, love. His phone rang. It was Charles Vasquez, still in prison, asking to talk. Richard hesitated but answered. "I've come to ask for forgiveness," Charles said, his voice broken. "Not for the crimes, but for wasting so much time chasing power." Richard responded with compassion. "What's important is that there's still time to change." After hanging up, he hugged Peter, who had arrived for dinner. Mrs. Maria prepared the food. Elena and Mariana chatted animatedly. Looking out the window, Richard saw Chicago light up. The city that had once been the stage for his unchecked ambitions now represented his redemption. Life, he had learned, wasn't about accumulating, but about sharing. Not about power, but about purpose. Not about individual success, but about collective transformation. Peter interrupted his thoughts. "Want to play chess?" Richard smiled. "Sure, but only if you promise to tell me about your new project at the university." Laughter filled the room. Love, respect, hope, feelings that once seemed so distant were now the essence of that family. Night fell over Chicago, enveloping the city in its dark mantle, but inside that house there was light. A light born of hope, change, the possibility of starting anew. A new story was just beginning.